I'm Jammer. So, I love comics. I love comics. I always have. And part of the reason that I love comics so much is because I was literally taught how to read using comics. This book here, in fact, well, not the specific edition, but at least a copy of this book, Calvin and Hobbes by Bill Watterson, a small collection of the first newspaper strips of the Calvin and Hobbes comic, was read to me by my mom. She would sit down with me, she would open the pages, and she would do the voices of Calvin, she would do a different voice for Hobbes, she would do a different voice for Mo, the bully, the mom, the dad, what have you. And I was just absolutely enamored, so much so that I more or less stole this book and then all of her other Calvin and Hobbes books, which were gifts from to her from my dad, and I just disappeared into the world of Calvin and Hobbes. I read. Whenever I would encounter a word or a concept I didn't know, my mom would tell me to look it up in the dictionary, and so I learned from this book. But just far more importantly, I was introduced to the concept, or excuse me, the various concept of literacy through comics. And Calvin and Hobbes basically fed me for years intellectually. But then something happened when I was in about fourth grade and a new book came out. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it with me here, but the title of it is called Captain Underpants. You might have heard of it. That book was really fun, especially for me who had trouble reading a lot of times. If it wasn't a comic, I really didn't respond to it as much as I really should have. But for whatever reason, Captain Underpants worked. And I think part of the reason was the two characters were two ill behaved young boys who were kind of outsiders, but more importantly, they spent all day sitting in their clubhouse making comic books. And what's really great about Captain Underpants is it's a picture book, and there are whole chapters that are nothing but the comics that the main characters George and Harold would make. So again, there seemed to continually be a trend in my life of comics really being equated with books that I enjoyed. Now, I promise there's one more story on here before I get to what I'm actually doing here. The third sort of major event, which really kind of sealed the deal for comics for me, came about in the, of course, I'm going to forget the date, kind of the early 2010s. I can't remember the date, I really should have looked it up. Anyway, there was a big publishing event by DC Comics titled The New 52. Again, you might have heard of it. If you didn't, the New 52 was a major event in which DC basically restarted a bunch of their major titles. So they began with Action Comics number 1, Batman number 1, Justice League number 1, Batman Detective Comics number 1, Action Comics number 1, and then spill down into other characters, side characters like Supergirl, Red Lantern's got their own comic book. Orange Lantern even got his own comic book. The story of Larfleeze is still comedic genius, and I will defend that to my last breath. But at that point in my life, I'd kind of abandoned comics. But a friend of mine came in, a coworker at that point, and he had just come back from my local comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics, and he just dropped a bunch of his comics on the table. It was a communal table where sometimes people would just work and study. And I remember grabbing some pencils and supplies, looking down, and seeing Joker's severed head between a bunch of doll heads and thinking, what is that? And I remember picking the book up and just looking through the pages and going, what is this? And when a friend of mine came over and talked to me about it, I'm like, where did you get these? I didn't even know you... I had no idea where to buy comics. And so he told me the store, Ground Zero Comics, and, well, I just hit up the store, I bought Batman Detective Comics, and then I picked up Scott Snyder's run on Swamp Thing, and then I picked up his run on Batman, The Court of Owls. I got Jeff Johns' The Justice League Origins, and then after that, I was just hooked on comics forever. And since that date, as you can see by this stack, and at some point I might have to pick up my phone here for a second, you'll see this whole room is just nothing but books, and at least 90% of those books are comics. So recently, I've got to adjust it again, one day we'll have a tripod. We'll have production values, I hope. Anyway, 90% of the books that I read are comics. And recently, for my job, I created a small video about how to make comics, and I was thinking again and again and again, why don't I just do something on YouTube about my love of comics? But there's already a lot of people out there already doing that. So what can I do that's different? To which case then I had a little bit of a brainstorm and I came up with a very simple question. What are comics? Now, that may at first seem like an easy question, but honestly, I really don't think it is, because looking at just Calvin and Hobbes, most people probably have a perception of what comics are. They were that page in the newspaper that most of us actually read, usually two or three little squares inside. There was some art with some cartoony characters, and in the third or fourth panel or something like that, there would be a joke. Cheap little gag, make you laugh. Then you turn the page, read your horoscope, and threw the newspaper away, because who reads newspapers anymore? For the record, plenty of people read newspapers. Anyway, that's, I think, most people's perception of what comics are. Or they probably perceive comics as superhero stories. And again, one of my stories was Captain Underpants. He was a superhero. Calvin and Hobbes regularly used Spaceman Spiff, and then Captain Stupendous. Oh my God, I almost forgot his name. That was a superhero who would regularly make appearances in the book. And again, the New 52. I got solidified into comics and being interested in comics because of superheroes. So moving forward, there's nothing wrong with superhero comics. And hopefully, if I keep doing this, I do intend to speak about a fair number of different types of superhero comic books. But for now, what I really want to focus on more is what is the form of the medium of comics. And that can actually be a little bit more of a difficult question. Fortunately, there's an amazing book out there which you can definitely pick up at your local comic book shop, and I guarantee you they will have it. It's called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This book, I cannot emphasize it enough, is vital reading for anybody who loves comics, is marginally interested in comics, or has no idea what comics are but would like to just learn a little bit more about it. Now, this book can be a little complex. He gets into the ideas of form, theory, execution, all that fun stuff that I think is cool, but if you're just a beginning reader, it may not be the best place to start. Nevertheless, I'm going to recommend this book, and I'm going to continue using this book as much as I possibly can. Beginning, first of all, with an actual definition of comics, because whenever you try to talk about something, you have to have an understanding of what your definition is. When you're talking about math, you need to know what is the definition of numbers, imaginary numbers, prime numbers, what have you. If you're talking about biology, you have to know the definitions of evolution, cellular respiration, what have you. If you're studying poetry, you have to know what meter, verse, iambic pentameter. These definitions are important because they'll help you understand how your medium works. So for comics, Scott McCloud really helped out comics makers, comics fans, comics aficionados, fancy pants word, by coming up with a definition. And he says it right here. Now that you've paused the video to actually read it, if you need to, just go back and rewind it. But I'll read it out loud too. He says, comics are juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. What does that mean? What that means is basically comics, as we'll understand it, are two or at least two images arranged together in a specific sequence to tell some kind of story. And that definition is really, really vital to understand. Because again, there's a lot of misconceptions about what comics are, how comics work, and how people can make comics. All right, that definition is in play though. We probably need to make sure that we have a nice visual understanding of it. So again, juxtapose pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence, aka at least two pictures arranged together to tell some kind of story. And Scott McCloud, genius that he is, uses this image here on the back of his book to help his reader out. We have this gentleman here who's wearing a top hat. I should have worn mine. Oh, next time. This gentleman is wearing a top hat. The next panel here, he is taking his top hat off and saying, hello there. It's not a complex story, but this little image right here, or these two images technically speaking, is the ultimate way to demonstrate what a comic is. You have two images arranged together in a specific way to tell some kind of story. There was a man with a hat. He took his hat off to say hello, and then in between these two squares, which are called panels, you have what's known as the gutter. And that gutter is how you show your reader that time and space has shifted in some form or capacity. So, looking right now at our definition, I hope you, whoever you are, have at least now a basic understanding of what a comic is and how it works. And that's really important because, again, with this, whatever this is, I'm going to be trying to just examine comics as a form, how they work, how they operate, why certain books are important, why certain books might suck, and then how certain books use this basic structure in order to tell stories. Okay, so we now have a definition of what comics are. We've seen a very, very general or very simple explanation of what a comic is and how it operates. Now, here comes the most important part, overcoming bias. Because again, I've kind of already addressed it, but even I had it going into it. Because even though I grew up reading Calvin and Hobbes, and even though I read every Captain Underpants book I got my hands on, at a certain point I stopped reading comics because I thought, oh, comics, they're just dumb superhero stories. They're not, quote, mature literature. For the record, I now have a master's degree in English, and I flipping love comics. So that attitude is just bogus. Comics are for everybody, and what's really great about the medium of comics, and what I'm about to really talk about now, is how comics are wonderful because there are no rules. What's amazing about the medium is it brings this fresh energy to the playing field, and anybody can tell any kind of story through the medium of comics. And as this stack behind me demonstrates, which I'm now going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to show you some of the different types of stories that you can read in comics to hopefully excite you and get your interest in. Now, if we look at this... Thank you, Neptune. All right. He's going to sit right there for a moment. Interesting visuals. Anyway, this stack behind me is a couple of examples of various types of comic books and some of the different comics publishers out there. And I'm going to just pull some titles off to show you, the different kind of stories that are able to be told in this medium. So if we look at the first one, Happy by Grant Morrison, this book is about a disgraced former cop who, on Christmas Eve, is suddenly more or less plagued by this flying blue unicorn named Happy, who informs him that he's the imaginary friend of a little girl who's been kidnapped. I can't make this up. This is actually what the sci-fi television series was based off of. And Grant Morrison is a man I promise you we're going to talk a lot about, hopefully in further videos. There is A Hard Goodbye, aka Sin City by Frank Miller. These books are canonical, especially in terms of the way Frank Miller played with the form of comics, and then the way he played with pulp, true crime, thriller, horror to tell just these gritty, nasty stories that visually are stunning, and in terms of stories are just really fun to read. The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi is another great book, which, like Sin City, has been made into a film. What's interesting about this book is, it, unlike the previous two, this is more of a air quote realistic graphic novel. It's the story, or it's a memoir of Marjane during her life while she was in Iran during the Iranian Revolution of the 1970s. Next one here is the recolored classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's a story about 4 turtles that get hit in a bizarre accident. They get exposed to radiation, and then they basically assume bipedal lifestyle and get trained in Kung Fu by a rat. I mean, you can't beat that. This book, this is something else we're going to talk about, hopefully in another later video, is manga. This is Asian-style comics, which has its own kind of general format, sometimes different topic styles, but this book, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, is another memoir. It's about a woman who lived in Japan, who was, one, dealing with the complexity of her sexuality, and then two, was dealing with her feelings of loneliness and isolation, both in terms of her from her parents, her friends, her society, what have you. Another small example of independent comics, this is called Eating Steve. It's a story about a young woman who, one night, out of nowhere, takes a bite out of her boyfriend's head and then gets kicked out of the apartment and has to figure out life on her own, all set against the backdrop of the zombie apocalypse. It's actually a really sweet little story. If you can find it, definitely check it out. There's another manga here, The Girl from the Other Side. This is part 5, you can see, in a pretty long series. It's about a little girl who encounters a monster who's been the victim of this plague. And what's unique is she demonstrates no signs of the plague and becomes the center of this mass national conspiracy. And it's, above everything else, a beautiful domestic story. This book here, speaking of superheroes, is Deadpool Killustrated. This book is literally Deadpool trying to kill himself by killing all the characters in classic literature and thus eliminating or killing the notion of stories and how they work. And I apologize if my colors start to fade off a little bit. Another example of superhero comic books, this is Superhero Red Sun. This one is pretty popular, however, because as you'll note by the crest on his chest, this story takes place in a kind of alternative reality where Superman didn't land in Kansas, he in fact landed in Soviet Russia. And, well, enough said. Another example of an indie comic is A Matter of Life by Jeffrey Brown. This is a small graphic novel which is about his life being grown up in a more evangelical Christian background and then eventually becoming an atheist while trying to raise his son. This book, which I guarantee you I will bring up many more times again, is A Contract with God by Will Eisner. Will Eisner is just, you can consider him one of the big top dogs in comics. He's the guy who coined the phrase graphic novel. This book is about immigrant life during the 1940s and 50s, and this book effectively established the graphic novel as a genre. There's just a couple more, and I'm probably not going to go through the whole stack looking at it now, because, oh my God, we're at 6 minutes. But just a couple more. This book here, Howl, is literally the graphic novelization of the poem by Allen Ginsberg, which created so much controversy when it was first published. Punk Rock Jesus is a Vertigo title. It's about a reality show where they clone Jesus Christ and then basically try to raise him up as an American citizen. Archie and Armstrong, Valiant Universe, a friend of mine, is absolutely obsessed with this universe. He recommended this series to me. The story is about a young man who's basically grown up in evangelical Disney World, taught that he is more or less the chosen one to destroy an eternal being by the name of Armstrong, who he eventually finds out is actually a pretty cool dude. Another example of interesting concepts, this book here by Gareth Hines is The Odyssey. This is literally the graphic novelization of the classic Greek tale and one of the foundational texts of Western civilization. From Hell by Alan Moore is literally a history / kind of fan fiction about the story of the life of Jack the Ripper. Trinity is a nonfiction history science book about the making of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project, the science of how the atomic bomb actually worked, and then a backgrounds of some of the politicians and scientists responsible for it. This book here, Sex Criminals Volume 1, is a book about a man and a woman who can literally freeze time by having orgasms. You can't make this up. Another great Image book, this one is really popular, Saga. It's basically Romeo and Juliet, but in space. It's a story of a man and a woman from different races who are currently in war against one another, who meet, fall in love, and have a child, and then spend the rest of their lives more or less being pursued by each of their cultures who find their love, their marriage, and their child an absolutely abhorrent reality. And then just one last book, I promise, because, oh my God, we're hitting at 8 minutes now, and I promised this was going to be short. But you can just see I'm geeking out. I have to share. This last one here is another example of what you can do with comics. This is literally a biography of the painter Pablo Picasso. But again, through comics. So, thank you, Neptune. Look at this stack, and just look how much I'm geeking out and having fun with it. But this stack, one was designed to show off how many comics I actually own, because, I mean, I have to brag. I am that vain. I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. I love comics, and I'm going to talk about it all day. But this mountain of comics, which is also another way of showing that I used to have money at one point in my life, is a way of hopefully showing you, the viewer, just how crazy comics can be, how crazy the medium can be. Just what's great about comics is that there are so many creators out there that see in this medium possibility. And not to shame other mediums of expression like film or sculpture or novels or poetry, what have you. They're fine genres, and you can do anything you want in them as well. But there's some energy in comics that I have always just kind of warmed to and always been attracted to, except for that one small period in my life. But, you know, whatever. The point is there's energy and potential in comics. And hopefully, if I keep making these videos and I have the gumption to keep making these videos and putting them out here, hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about. These videos, and hopefully there's going to be more than one, are just going to be about talking about comics that I think are cool, talking about how they work, how they operate, what do they contribute to the form, do they contribute anything to the form, and then also hopefully it'll just inspire you to go out and pick up a couple of comics, read them for yourselves, and see if you find that same level of energy. Again, what's really fun about comics is you can do anything. Whether it be tell the story of an imaginative little boy who sees a whole personality in his stuffed tiger, or two little boys who imagine a superhero who wears nothing but underwear and then tricking their principal into wearing nothing but underwear using a magic hypno ring, or whether it's seeing Joker's severed head, or God, even if it's just reading the story, one more, I lied. Even if it's reading just the story of Phone Bone, who's obsessed with Moby Dick and participates in the Great Cow Race. You can do anything with comics, and I'm going to hopefully show you that in these videos and hopefully impart that lesson to you. So please, 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 if you take nothing else from all this rambling and ranting and goofiness, please see, or at least appreciate, that comics are fun, and you can do so much with them. And hopefully, if you've read enough of them like I will, or I have, you'll come away with that same idea and think to yourself, God, I really love comics. Well, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you, whoever you are out there, for watching. I really appreciate it. Again, hopefully there's going to be more than one of these. This has just been kind of building in my head a lot lately. I also apologize if my chair was creaking in the background. It's a bad chair. Hopefully I'll get a new one soon. But thank you for watching. And if you like this and like kind of what I'm doing with these, please feel free to comment in the section below. Tell me what you like, what you don't like. If there's comics that you think are really cool and you would like to suggest to read them to me, by all means, throw them my way. Also, if you just love making comics or have ideas for comics yourself, comment below. I can't always guarantee I'm going to respond right away, but I'll do my very best to get back to you. And again, thanks for watching. Go out there and read some comics.